Just before we start, I wanted to give some caveats about our presentation. So basically, this is an adaptation of a talk by Adriano Mannino Ruairí Donnelly at Sentience Politics. So if you've already seen that, this is basically a ripoff of their talk. We're just going to try to make it a little bit shorter, a little bit more accessible, less philosophical and technical.
Ironically, the big guy which has the intelligence beyond the dog is eating. I agree with you.
Yeah, we're not going to spend as much time talking about defining speciesism, but because we are at the Animal Rights Center, so we assume most people already agree that speciesism is a problem. And we know that the topic can be very controversial, so we would just ask you to try to save your questions. If you have like specific objections, save them for when we deal with the objections. So when we get to that objection of yours, then we can have group discussions. But before that, clarifying questions all are good as long as we don't start getting into the objections too early. And finally, we're not experts on this topic at all. Even though we both have a background in philosophy, there's a lot of people who've been really working on this, but we're just here because we think this is a topic that we can all learn more about, but we're not experts. There's probably a lot of people in this room that have read more about it than we have, so feel free to jump in if you have any corrections, information, comments, suggestions as we go along. All right? Julian, if you wouldn't mind hitting the next slide.
So wild animal suffering is a pretty neglected topic. As Orlando said, there are a few people in the world who are actually working on this topic, but it's extraordinarily uncommon for anybody to even care about wild animal suffering at all. And so one of the things one of the reasons we want to talk about it is simply so that you will talk about it. Because we think that if you ask yourself, what can I do about wild animal suffering? The answer might be something, but the answer is certainly going to involve talking about it more, spreading the meme that we should care about wild animals. So we're going to present to you at first just a very stripped down version of an argument that we should deal with wild animal suffering. And one way or another, we'll get the slide for you. But essentially the first premise is simply that we should help someone who is in suffering. So take, for example, if someone's suffering, we should help them. So you can take, for example, a small child drowning in a pond, splashing about, and you can easily wade in and help the child. How many of you think we should not help that child? Okay, good. I'm hoping that would be true. So what about maybe like if you have like a picture, there's a little dog who's lost, and this is dog. And the dog has like a collar, like clearly was well loved, but the dog is injured and she can't even move around. Her leg is like caught in something. How many of you think we should not try to help the dog find her way home? Okay. Nobody thinks that. We should obviously help this injured animal that happens to be domesticated. But what really is the difference if this animal happened to be a wild one instead of a domesticated one? Like a wild dog would feel the same sorts of pains and have the same sorts of experiences. So that's the intuition behind that first premise. The second premise is simply that there is suffering in the wild, and we'll talk a bit about the specifics of that and the grand scale of that. And so the conclusion of the argument is then that we should therefore help those whom we can help who are suffering in the wild. Questions clarifying any of that so far? What do we have next? So life in the wild is sometimes thought to be really great. If you watch Bambi, then you happen to, maybe you were convinced by that as a child that all of nature comes together and plays harmoniously, or in The Lion King you have young warthogs and wildebeest, or what was Timon? Anyway, a meerkat. He's like hanging out with Simba, the lion. But in reality, lions actually rip those kinds of beings to shreds as soon as they see them, if they're feeling hungry. So we might call that first picture the transcendentalist picture of nature, on which nature is just a really nice place where everyone gets along, and there's nothing that should be changed about it. But I think a more realistic perspective, when you really study biology and you study how things work in nature, especially from a Darwinian point of view, you realize that nature is characterized by the survival of the fittest. And so there are lots of strategies that species will use to try to survive on to the next generation. Let's see. So here's some examples. Just keep on scrolling through that if you don't mind. So there's some examples of problems you might face if you're in the wild. So I think the middle one is actually what I want to mention first, which is just thirst and starvation. Right? If you're a wild creature, you don't necessarily have food provided for you. In fact, much of your existence may involve going around looking for your next meal or your next drink. It's not precisely as easy as it is when you're a domesticated animal. Similarly, you're going to be in circumstances where it could be really cold or really hot, and you don't necessarily have shelter that you can take. You may often find yourself being pursued by predators and fearing for your life. You may undergo disease, various kinds of parasites, and it's pretty easy to get injured and not have any recourse, no veterinarians to help you if you're a wild animal. And so these are various respects in which veterinarians have commented that life in the wild is much worse in terms of the conditions individuals live in than being a domesticated animal. And it's not something that we often think about. So again, we're assuming that if you're in this room, you care about, or at least know someone who cares about all animals, regardless of what their species is, right? That it shouldn't matter what someone's species is. If they're in pain, then that pain matters. So one sort of biological concept that's at least roughly accurate of the way that species reproduce is known as R selection versus K selection. Now, K selection is what we do as humans. We have few offspring and invest a lot in them to try to ensure that they mature onto adulthood. I did not mix those up, right? Correct. I'm correct. But more common in the animal kingdom is R selection, where the individual strategy is to produce a lot of offspring, and only a small fraction of them will make it to adulthood, to sexual maturity, and the majority of those creatures will die in some way before they can actually reproduce. So this gives you, and it's more common in the animal kingdom for creatures to engage in R selection. And so just for an example, like there's a quotation from the biologist Fred Hapgood that I'll share with you here. He writes that all species reproduce in excess, way past the carrying capacity of their niche. In her lifetime, a lioness might have 20 cubs, a pigeon 150 chicks, a mouse 1,000 kits, a trout 20,000 fry, a tuna or cod 1,000,000 fry or more, and an oyster perhaps 100 million spat. If one assumes that the population of each of these species is, from generation to generation, roughly equal, then on average, only one offspring will survive to replace each parent. All the other thousands and millions will die one way or another. This gives you an idea of the percentage of lifespan that an individual might spend in suffering or pain before they die, before reaching sexual maturity. And at least in some cases, their deaths are going to involve a certain amount of suffering, maybe a great amount. So yeah, this is just an example of rats maybe producing like 20 or so in every litter, only some of which will survive to adulthood. If the population is in equilibrium, then it's going to be like 1 out of 20 for the mother, or 2 out of 20 for the mother and the father, roughly.
Yeah, and we see this in many different species, that they have dozens or hundreds of children, and then over 90% of them just lead very short, horrible, painful deaths. So the extent of the problem is humongous.
It's important to recognize we're not saying that every wild creature is living a terrible life. There probably are going to be some examples you can think of where it's really great to be a wild whatever. However, we're saying that in very many cases there is a lot of suffering involved. And our conclusion is just that we should intervene, if we can, where there is wild animal suffering. Just to like expand on this just a tad bit more, there's kind of a spectrum that you might take where you think it's like really bad to be a wild animal on average, and that we should intervene a lot. And you might think there's just some like pockets of badness. And if you take that view, you might only think you should intervene a more modest amount, or maybe in localized ways where there are pockets of badness, rather than, say, re-engineering the whole biosphere or something like that, which you might be interested in if you're toward the right side of that spectrum. So we know that a lot of you care about the suffering of domesticated animals, especially those that are raised for food. And we think that in many cases it's important to understand precisely what happens in factory farms behind those walls. So similarly, we think that it's important to understand by seeing what happens in the wild when animals suffer, just to get a sense of how important it is for us to focus on it. Now, in the interest of that, we thought we would show a short clip that kind of explains through showing what that's like. Now, of course, if you don't like to see graphic imagery, we definitely will understand if you want to step out for 5 minutes or cover your eyes or ears. Definitely nothing wrong with doing that. But in the interest of that, we'll go ahead and show that small clip.
Yeah, especially if you've seen the impact that graphic footage has on meat eaters to actually engage and actually realize how bad it is. So especially if you feel like wild animal suffering is like somewhat abstract to you and you're saying, I don't think it's that really a big of a deal. It's like the same thing. The meat eater gets pushed to facing the issue by seeing the reality. This is the same way. If you don't feel like this is too big of an issue, you should, like the meat eater, try to see it in the face and see if you are okay with it or not. So with that, let's, could you click on where it says video, please, Julian?
is the size of a grain of rice, but together they account for over a third of the caterpillar's weight.
I've got the news with me. She was pregnant. Oh my goodness. Oh, amazing. Oh shit. Ah, yeah, that's a bit there. We would have expected that one.
So this is what National Geographic doesn't show us, right? They show us the chase and they show us the ones where they got away, and you can see why they don't show us this. So just like our food system doesn't show us how animals are killed either. This is what people don't like to see, and this is why we continue having this idea that nature is a great place and nature knows best, when in reality nature is pretty horrible, pretty scary, pretty painful. So yeah, we know that was really hard to watch, especially thinking about the scale of things, but we really need to be aware of that in order to properly think about the objections that we bring to why this is important. So I think the main underlying issue that I find with people that don't agree with helping animals in the wild is that they confuse these two things. Morality, like whether we should do it or not, with possibility, whether we can do it and help or not. So I ask people, should we intervene in the wild and help animals? And they're like, no. I'm like, why? Because we can't. And I'm like, I'm not asking you if we can or not properly. I'm just asking you whether we should. And then they say, but we can't. No, we can't. I'm like, that's not my question. I'm just asking, if we could one day, should we do it? And they're like, but we're never going to be able to. And I'm like, that's not the question. I'm just asking you, if we could, theoretically, if we could intervene and know that we're going to help, should we do it? And then they're like, okay, I guess we should. That's what we're asking for. We're not here to tell you that we can or that we cannot. We're just here saying, if we can, we definitely should, and we have a moral obligation, just like we would help a drowning child, we should be thinking about helping animals in the wild. So this is a quote from Oscar Orta, who works at Animal Ethics, and he says, our job now is to prepare the ground for forthcoming generations to take action where we may be currently unable to act. So that is how we should frame the entire issue. Not like, oh, but we can't do that right now, or we're going to mess this up and that. We need to start thinking about these things now, because when the technology arrives that we do know that we can do something, we shouldn't then say, oh, should we do something? And then we need to start this debate and spreading this through society. We need to start thinking about this now so we can keep our eyes open for that technology and so we can develop that technology whenever we feel that we can. So the first and most common objection comes from people who just say, well, animals in the wild don't matter. They're just animals. Who cares? They're not humans. That's basically just speciesism. And since we're at the Berkeley Animal Rights Center, I assume most people here already agree that speciesism is not something that we should be promoting. So my only response against this argument is like, yes, they do matter. Obviously they do. There's no reason to discriminate against another being based on the color of their skin or their gender or their age or their species or any characteristics that they didn't choose. Just because they were born a certain way, it doesn't mean that we should discriminate against them. So animals, whether they're here in this room or whether they're a million miles away, all of them matter equally, regardless of how they were born. The second most common argument is, but it's just nature, you know? It's just what happens in nature, that's it. And this kind of implies that nature is good, that nature is wise, that nature knows best. And it's a good argument that you hear a lot, but it's really interesting when you hear it from vegans. Because we get this all the time. People tell us, why are you vegan? Lions kill other animals. And then we say, oh, no, you can't use nature to justify our behavior. Nature can be used to justify many horrible things, like rape, like killing babies, like eating each other alive. So we know that nature cannot be used as an excuse to justify something. So we should not be using nature as an excuse to justify the suffering of other animals in the wild. Like, medicine is obviously not natural, but we all agree that vaccines, I hope that we all agree that vaccines are good and that medicine and that pills that you take are good and help you right? And just because it's not natural doesn't mean that it's not good, and vice versa. Disease is good because it's natural. Oh, you have, you know, measles. Okay, that's fine. It's good because it's natural. You know, it's just not an argument. A thought experiment is, you know, what about wild humans in this isolated population, and they don't speak English, and there's a famine and they're starving to death? Should we just say, oh, that's nature, you know, we shouldn't help them? Of course not. We should help humans. And then if you believe that we should help humans, then why wouldn't we help other animals in that same position? And if you think there's a difference, try to think if it's coming from speciesism, because, oh, we should care about humans and not about other animals. And a more interesting thought experiment is wild slaughterhouses. So what if slaughterhouses just sprung out of the ground, no planning, just like they spring out of the ground, uncontrolled, unplanned, and they do the same thing that our slaughterhouses do, but they're out there in the wild, and tons of animals are suffering in them? Would we say, oh, since there's no planner for that slaughterhouse, since no one's making a profit, then it's okay? Is it okay to have a slaughterhouse as long as no one's profiting of it? No, what matters is not the profit or the intent behind the slaughterhouse. What matters is that there's animals suffering in there. And if we believe that we should help animals suffering, it doesn't matter how they got to suffer. It just matters that we eliminate their suffering. Does anyone have any questions about this objection? And Jay, if you want to jump in and help me, if anyone has any questions about this specific objections. I didn't spend time on speciesism because that's a given, but what about this one? Yes?
You might want to park this for another time, but
Yeah.
just thinking, especially because you brought up the wild humans thing, like the way Jay talked about that scale of like really bad optics of that with like non-humans, I just think like if we extend a lot of implications of that too.
Right. So yeah, the comment was, it really depends on how bad it is, whether we decide to intervene or not. And in the case of wild animals, it really is really bad. So I think that would push us towards intervening more. But we'll talk about the specifics of when to intervene or not. Yes?
And this is another thing that may be another slide, but like colonialism, imperialism, you know, with wild humans, I think there are probably cases where people are suffering, and there are ways it seems we might be able to intervene that people are still not comfortable with because it's colonialist, imperialist. There are, you know, more sophisticated ways of putting that it's like it could go back to the possibility thing that we, or a bias that we're just very arrogant and prone to make mistakes in this domain. So anyway,
Yeah. No, I think that's a good one, and I think like most of those foreign interventions have been done under the pretense of humanitarian intervention, but in reality from a capitalist background. Like, oh, let's go help, you know, but who's helping? It's the US that's helping, and you know, our system with all its inherent flaws saying, oh, we're gonna go help there, but then who gets the money for the contract and the corruption and everything? So I would say most of our interventions don't have the explicitly clear aim to go and help. And yeah, sometimes they do cause harm, sometimes they work, but no one would say we should never, ever intervene because there's a possibility of harm. And yet that's what we're saying with animals. We should never, ever intervene. With humanitarian intervention, we say, yes, sometime we should intervene if we think the risks are low enough, then we should intervene. No one says we should never intervene. Yet for animals, this is what many people say, we should never intervene. But we're going to talk about humanitarian intervention in the next slide. So is it related to this one or the past one?
No, I don't know. I think it's a little like what Zach said.
Okay.
I guess like when we had a special one of those things that I had was, what is the impact of our intervention? Let's say, for example, that, I don't know, we see lions killing zebras, we don't want them to kill zebras, so we put like a tracker in every single zebra, so that if like a lion gets close to a zebra, we go there and like stop the fight, and then the zebra doesn't die. But then because we do that, then the lions start eating rabbits. Now they're eating like, let's say like 20 times more animals because we did that. So I guess like my concern with like a lot of that is like, if you go and promote veganism, there's not as much of a problem because, you're taking the person who's gonna kill an animal to eat, and you're telling them to eat vegetables. And even if you're like, oh, but vegetables, they're insects, whatever, like still like you use less grains. So it seems to me that it's pretty clear cut that it's a good thing. With the wild animal intervention, and like for some of it, I'm a little like skeptical. I'm not skeptical. I'm just like, as like Zach was saying, like I'm just afraid that we like think that we know what's best and we don't.
Yeah.
So like, what do you think about that?
That's a very good question, and we will address that one. If for some reason you feel like we didn't, bring it up again. But I'm pretty sure we're going to address that one. So for example, some say, oh, it's not our place to intervene because, lions are not bad people. They're not responsible. They don't have a choice, right? And we're not saying that lions are bad. We're not saying that they're morally responsible. We know that they don't have a choice, but that doesn't mean that they should have free reign to do what they want. So let me give you an example. What if someone has a disease where they can only survive by replacing their organs constantly? Let's say every year you need your heart replaced, your kidney replaced, and your lungs and whatever, like a lot of organs that you just can't get from a regular hospital. So imagine if I have that disease, and then I go around and I say, hey, the only way to survive is to just kill people and steal their organs. And it's like, I have to do it to survive, I have to, and I'm not doing it because I want to. Will you then say, okay, just go ahead and do it and just let me go around killing hundreds, thousands of people just because I needed to survive? Just because I needed to survive doesn't mean that we should just allow it to keep going forever and ever and ever, right? If we can find a way, we would try to stop me somehow because we weigh the benefits and the costs. And even though we understand that I'm doing it to survive, it doesn't justify me going and killing a whole bunch of other humans. And another example to kind of illustrate that more, what if we were obligate carnivores like lions? So what if we had to eat animals to survive? Would it mean that we would just say, let's just give up on veganism and let's just keep eating animals forever? Or should we still say, how can we reduce the suffering to the least number of animals? How can we try to develop technologies like lab-grown meat? How can we find ways around it? What do you think we would say? If we believe in reducing suffering, whether we're obligate carnivores or not, it doesn't change the premise that we want to reduce suffering. It just means that it's going to be technically more difficult to do, but it doesn't mean that we would just give up on reducing suffering and just go around killing animals because we have to. We can always try to help and reduce as much as we can. Does anyone have any questions about this one? About policing nature, and it's not our place to police nature? Okay, I think this one is the one that Lucas and Zach were touching on. It's just, why even try? There's nothing we can do. We're going to make it worse than it was when we started, right? And this is one of the most substantive arguments against it. So to start off, there are things we can do, and there are things that we have already done that have shown to work. Like in Europe, we can vaccinate foxes against rabies by just leaving biscuits with those vaccines, and then they don't get rabies. So yes, it has worked. Maybe there's a concern that, these foxes aren't dying, and then maybe they're killing others, and then so on and so forth. But we could say the same of humans. Yeah, we vaccinate humans, then they don't die, and then they go and eat all these other animals. So then should we stop vaccinating humans because we don't know what the repercussions of that will be? No, right? Should we stop giving medicine to humans because then they may go and like abuse other people? No, we weigh the risk and the benefits and we decide that we should help humans. So if we can, we should help other animals as well. And we have at least some possibility of doing it right now. Obviously, not perfectly, not even close to safely right now to go through mass interventions, but there are small ways that we can start thinking about helping. Feeding programs are shown to work too. So just giving animals food, even though they've been done mostly for the interest of hunters, they have shown to work, so we can make them work. And another good question is, how much worse can we make it when about 99% of beings out there are currently suffering these horrible, painless deaths because the numbers are so big? We need to weigh the interest of intervention versus not doing anything. We just think, oh, if we intervene, it may be bad. Well, if we don't intervene, it will be bad. It is bad. So we need to weigh those two before deciding, how much worse can we actually make it. And the question about humanitarian intervention, there's always risks and benefits to any intervention that we do. But we constantly keep intervening in terms of humans. We constantly do it, and nobody would say that we should never intervene. So if you agree that we should sometimes intervene for humans, then you should agree that we should sometimes intervene for wild animals, if we have the same level of certainty. Now, you may say, oh, but we don't have that same level of certainty. I'm not saying that we do. I'm just saying, if we have that same level of certainty, then we should intervene. So if you believe with a 50% certainty we should intervene for humans, you should also believe that with a 50% certainty we should intervene for animals. If you don't, then that's speciesism. Or that's maybe you believe that the science is lacking and there's issues with the science and there may be repercussions that we're not noticing, but the same may be true with humans when we intervene. And finally, we already intervene all the time. Like when we build roads, when we build towns, buildings, we're already intervening in the wild, but just in horrible, terrible ways. So if we're already doing it, if you're for building roads, if you're for development, then you're already saying that it's okay to intervene in the wild as long as it benefits humans. So why is it not okay to try to intervene with purpose to try to help all these wild animals that are suffering? And Jay, if you want to help me in this one, because I think this one will have the hardest questions, then I've taken all the questions so far. So if anyone has any questions about this one. No? Okay, we can save the questions till the end as well. We have a part for discussion. So, last issue is the one that we hear vegans all the time as well. Why are you focusing on that? Why not focus on all these other problems that are happening first? So how do we determine what's a morally pressing issue? How do we determine what we should focus on first? And some idea is to look at the number of victims. And from this perspective, it's very clear that the number of victims is very, very large. So at least from this perspective, it should be an important moral issue.
So yeah, there was a slide that we lost somehow, but it contained certain numbers of animals in the wild that, just to give an idea of how many of them might be suffering. So you're familiar with the idea that there are 7 billion humans in the world, right? So that's 7 times 10 to the 9th. Well, the number of land livestock that we raise for food is about 10 to the 10th times 2.5. or 250. About 10 billion. So these are numbers from
Probably more than 10 billion.
Yeah, not 10 billion. 25 billion. Thank you. So. Yeah. So the term I meant was I used was livestock. At any rate, these are numbers that come from a paper by Brian Tomasic, which I would recommend reading his stuff on this.
Yeah, and we'll post that slide on the event page afterwards, so you can look at the scale of the problem.
So just to give a couple more figures, land reptiles are estimated between 10 to the 12th to 10 to the 13th, or 1,000 times more than humans, to 10,000 times more than humans. Land amphibians 10 to the 12th to the 10 to the 13th again, and fish could be 10 to the 13th or to 10 to the 15th or more. So if you think that animal agriculture is a huge scale problem, which it is, well, wild animal suffering is going to be orders of magnitude larger in scale.
Yeah, much larger, almost unimaginably so, that we reach the point where we really can't empathize, because if we do, we're just going to break down and not be able to function and do anything, because the problem is so big. Adam, did you have a question?
Yeah, sometimes people talk about like X percentage of like the world's biomass is in like animals that we raise for food. But I always imagined there was way more wild animals, so I don't know. I don't know if you've heard of that or you can clarify what you say that.
I have heard of that, and that does sound like a contradiction, unless it's the size of the animals. The size of the animals are taken into account. So since cows are big and pigs are big compared to most of the animals that are selected are smaller. So they're smaller, but there's more of them.
Imagine most of them are babies when they die. They're even smaller than the adult form of the animal that you're probably imagining.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems like in the video, a lot of the focus is on predation and elephants and lions, whereas that's, I think, at least elephants and lions are a very small part of the problem. And I imagine predation is even, I would think disease and things like that are almost even worse than predation.
Yeah, that's very possible. Like, I think a lot of baby animals that die just die of starvation and things like that. Just like, because you can imagine there are just like fewer resources, and if you're like competing with others, like resources. So yeah, it's like mouse-sized animals are smaller. So like you could have, thousands and thousands of them to equal the weight of one cow. So the world's biomass could be like more farm animals than others.
Yeah, I imagine the reason that this was the video that Ru and Adriano also used. I imagine whoever put that together had basically the same idea in mind when we show videos of slaughterhouses, and we don't focus on fish as much as we do in pigs, cows, and chickens, in order to make the problem, more visible and visceral. So I imagine that's why they put it together. But that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that.
I think it's also possible that like nature videos just focus on large animals for the sake, just because it's more interesting to people. So like they might not even have had much material to focus on the suffering of like smaller animals.
Yeah.
So on the comment about biomass, one really interesting thing is that whereas humans, so basically, land invertebrates outweigh humans in biomass by about 10 to 25 times. So this is going to be mostly, the things that we think of as bugs, insects, arachnids, and so on.
Okay. So we're almost done here, and then we'll get to the discussion. So the other issue, when we can determine what's important, what we should focus on, is tractability. Can we actually do anything about it? And of course, it's related to size, and it's related to how neglected the problem is. And since this is a humongous problem, and there's so few people doing anything about it, it has a lot of potential for helping. So given those two, we would argue that it is a very pressing issue. at the moment. However, a way to address it is this: focusing on farm animal suffering problem first. But you can still talk about it at the same time. So, since so many people still are speciesists in this world, they're not going to be on board with all the other problems because they still haven't gotten through the first objection. So, by focusing on farmed animals, which seems easier for people to understand, to relate to, and to grasp that argument, if we can get them to understand speciesism, then the other arguments are going to be much easier. So it makes sense to focus first on farm animal suffering, especially since we can do more about those right now. However, we should not say that that means that we shouldn't talk about it, and that we shouldn't focus on it, and that we shouldn't bring it up, or that we should just neglect this problem. Yeah, Jay?
Does this imply that there are some messages you can send about farmed animal suffering that might convince people more easily, but that might be damaging to wild animal suffering? I sometimes worry that a rights-based we should leave them alone because they have a right to be left alone message might resonate with people, but might ultimately kind of make them less receptive to wild animal suffering.
Yeah.
Some other arguments for you should go vegan because I know DXC doesn't do this, but focusing on the health benefits, focusing on the environmental stuff. So I feel like even if we focus on farmed animal stuff first, if we have an eye to this, then that implies things about
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. If we just say leave them alone, don't kill animals, don't eat animals, just leave them alone, that kind of builds towards, nature is good. But if we keep that in mind, we can change that. So, go ahead.
Yeah, I think on that point, there was a study by animal charity evaluators. If I remember correctly, I don't actually think it was suffering versus rights, but it was animal versus environmental.
Yeah, it was cruelty versus environment versus control. I would recommend that study that closely.
Okay, never mind.
But I think the part of it that I think is probably right is that if you focus on environmental issues that have messaging about leaving the environment as a pristine and untouched place, that could make people more opposed to future interventions that involve doing something in nature or messing with it because you spend time convincing them that's not a very good thing to do, and now you're going around and telling them to do it. I have problems with the methodology of that study, but that seems like a pretty plausible link to me.
Yeah, the study was exploratory. So
Yeah, it was an
it's
amateur
only
study.
it's only something to start from, but it's suggested at least.
All right. The discussion is really interesting. So let's just finish up with these interventions. So we thought possible interventions that we've read about are vaccines, obviously, contraceptives, spaying and neutering, although these ones have their own issue that we can talk about because it would violate their bodily autonomy. So that's a whole other issue that we can talk about in the discussion. Using lab-grown meat to feed obligate carnivores so they don't have to go around killing animals if they have a place where you give them food every day, like we do with cats. If you go and you feed cats every day, they'll know to come back and get their food there, so they're less likely to go around killing for food when they're hungry. And then building those land bridges over highways so they don't get run over by cars. And far future intervention, bioengineering predators so they don't need to eat animals. Maybe using contraception so their former prey populations stay under control, again, problematic. And finding a way to cognitively engineer away suffering, also controversial. So let's talk about it.
Could you maybe go back to the list of interventions?
Yeah, to the more controversial ones. Yeah. You kind of like what?
Oh, I kind of like the last one because it's sort of makes everything else, well, not necessarily, but if you could just make animals not suffer through, like, they don't feel pain. You'd still be killing a lot of animals, but, which is a problem in itself.
Yeah.
But it seems to cover a lot of issues.
Yeah, the controversy thing is like some farmers have said that they want to do that and keep breeding animals. So I don't know. What do people feel about it? Yeah, go ahead.
Might take away physical suffering, but not emotional suffering from like the animals that lose, like, I don't know, family members, because I don't know.
If what?
Let's say that like nobody feels physical pain, so like you go and like, I guess, and then you go and like I don't know, kill like this like baby, I don't know, rabbit, and then the mom has to have emotional pain because of that. Then you can also take out their emotional suffering, but then you just create a vegetable.
Yeah, and if people could speak up so the people on the live stream can hear us too. Zach, you have something?
Yeah, so I guess I had 2 points. The first was on Lucas's note. My understanding is there's a British philosopher, David Peirce, who's proposed not that you just get rid of suffering, but that you replace it with like various degrees of pleasure, so that you still have the incentive structure and the experiences. You just get rid of that negative side. Anyway, and it's all very. This is like as speculative as it possibly get. But the other thing was, I have a lot of sympathy with the last point, but I think that last point, and maybe maybe it would be interesting to just talk about whether this is the case for the whole issue, but certainly that last point I think is something we talk amongst ourselves. We don't go out and talk, certainly not to Animal Ag about, because they always like to propose the idea, well, let's just make it so they don't suffer while we rip them apart. And it's, I think it's just, when they say it, it's always like just sort of a way to pacify people so they can keep on doing it.
Especially like, I'm just incredibly skeptical that we're like close to this technology. So if someone in like 2 or 5 or like even 20 years claims to have engineered away suffering, like I wouldn't, it's very hard to tell what like another being is experiencing if it can't speak to you, or like even if it can. So it's like.
Yeah, another good thing is to think, what if we did this to humans and we just raised humans for flesh or sexual pleasure, and we just engineered away their suffering? Would that be okay? I don't know. But let's use our hands to try to stay on track. Danielle?
I don't know if this is what Zach is trying to say, but also if you eliminate an individual's ability to suffer, you might also affect their ability to survive, because isn't that, in nature, doesn't that teach an individual like what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do? It's like they avoid pain, so they do certain things that will help them survive. So that could be another issue.
Lucas?
Yeah, I was gonna bring the same point that I've seen like documentaries on people who like actually don't have, I don't know, the nervous terminations or whatever that actually lets them feel pain, but they actually have terrible lives because they just keep on tripping on things and getting like massive bruises because they don't know what is good or bad for them.
Yeah, there's a little girl who like scratched her eyeballs out because
Oh,
she
yeah.
didn't know
Yeah.
that she didn't feel anything.
Yeah.
So I think that the last claim was framed as really ambitious and problematic, but there are going to be lots of localized ways that you can try to engineer away suffering in any sense of that term. So just think about the disease called myxomatosis. Has anybody heard of that?
Yeah, it's a rabbit.
So what happens with the rabbits when they get it?
I don't actually know.
Yeah, it's something to do with like inflammation of their nasal tract. But it's really painful for the rabbits. It takes them a long time to pass away when they have it. And if there was some sort of intervention that just made that less bad for them, that would be a way of like bioengineering the actual pathogen that causes this, that would then reduce suffering for the rabbits. And you'd still presumably have like rabbits dying at a certain rate. It might not affect their equilibrium very much, but they would have to die with less suffering involved.
Going off your point, an idea that I think is a little bit easier to swallow than cognitively engineering away all suffering is sort of capping suffering, so that you can feel mildly bad experiences or even moderately bad ones, but are unable to feel like pain to the extent that would be considered emotional or physical torture, because usually before you get to that point, you're already trying to deal with the problem. Maybe if you've stepped on something uncomfortable, you've moved away from it from just a little bit of pain. But it's really that torturous suffering and moments of dying that seems to pull a lot of the weight of wild animal lives potentially being quite bad, and yet it doesn't serve necessarily as much of a strong purpose as the more milder forms.
Yeah, go ahead.
And there are ways we can think about this that are not like involving bioengineering in any particular way. Like, for example, like painkillers, like kind of the way we just distribute vaccines to animals. It would probably be more like logistically challenging to give animals painkillers, but like, I mean, they've done experiments with like hens, and like how they prefer to eat feed with painkiller in it, and like, I've also heard ideas. I'm not sure how practical it is to like have like anesthetic in like the claws and teeth of lions, so that their prey like don't feel pain. The issue with that like might be that like the prey might be anesthetized when it actually had a chance to escape, and like, now dies.
Yeah. So what about these ones for people who hadn't thought the wild animal suffering was important? How do you guys feel about these ones? Do you still feel like we should not have any questions, thoughts? Danielle?
I like the idea of that when we used to feed other carnivores, but I think that who would do that? That would be the question. How would we? I mean, it's already hard enough to care for, like, for example, the dogs and cats that are in shelters. We don't even have enough people to care for those animals, so they're euthanized. And so if we started feeding wild animals, then the problem would be like, we'd have to continue that, they would rely on us for survival, and then that would be a whole other issue. So, but I like that idea. I don't know.
Does anyone in the audience want to address that, or should I saw a hand? No? No? Jay?
So if I may speculate, you're really good. It's a really good question. Who is going to actually make the lab-grown meat that the lions are going to eat? Well, who's going to feed them? So, like, maybe a realistic picture, or like more realistic, relatively, would be you somehow make a plant that grows like really good lion tofu, so that it like self-manufactures. Then you breed lions in a certain way such that they like tend to prefer that, and you breed the ones that prefer the lion tofu together with each other and release these out in the wild. That would be a way of like, maybe more realistically trying to achieve that.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to that first point that I made, which was try not to think about it of whether this is possible. It's just whether we should do it, So it may take, 10 years, 1,000 years for us to have solved the problem of our dogs and cats, and we have enough food, and then we do know that we have enough food to be able to go out there and not feed every single lion, but 1,000 lions. And then when we do have that are we then going to say, oh, should we do this? Should we go feed those lions and reduce the number of animals they're killing? Let's have a philosophy class about this and try to decide. It's like, no, we need to talk about this now so we can think ahead, and whenever we do have the ability, we can do that. Whether that means hiring people, just that we have houseless shelters which give away free food, we could have people that just specialize in going out in the wild and feeding these animals once a day, or I don't know. Any more thoughts? Yeah.
I just wanted to say really quickly, like there are some things that like are somewhat less like weird seeming and like more feel good that we already do for wild animals. Like there are hospitals where people, like there are vets that just like find injured wildlife and like heal them and like send them back out into the wild. Like, that's something we already do, and something that a lot of people could get behind. And so there is like common ground here for people who are like freaked out by the ambition of all of this to like see that there are clearly helpful things we can do that are not like arrogantly like running all over the issue or something.
Yeah, Zach? Adam?
So, what about just like deliberately, I don't know the verb form of it,
extinguishing.
Extinguishing, thank you. What about deliberately extinguishing? Well, frankly, humans for that matter.
That's a good question. So what if we, what if we actually went around and we shot like every lion in the head and killed them all? How do people feel about that? Like, what if we went and we shot? So because we wouldn't shoot like human serial killers.
Well, I think wouldn't that be speciesism because you're singling out lions or like carnivores? Like who are we to say that they're less important than herbivores? You know?
Well, we wouldn't say that they're less important. We're just saying if each lion kills 100 herbivores in their lives, if we kill one lion, then 100 herbivores are going to be happy. So it's like the same mentality like with serial killers going to go around killing tons of people. Most people would say, maybe we wouldn't say kill them, maybe we would just say keep them restrained. So maybe we don't have to kill lions, maybe we can just keep them restrained and apart from predators. I don't know.
But if the herbivores are going to suffer, what about just like killing other species too that they can suffer, right?
So just killing the herbivores too, so they don't suffer.
Like killing them, I mean, if anything, presumably, like what I'm saying is, like if a human suffers X, like their life has this amount of suffering, that's less, like it's worse than just neutral, but like they should be also built into that.
That's what the hunters use though. When they are they're suffering, so they're putting that on losing life in here.
Yeah.
So, sorry. Did I interrupt you? So the answer to your question of should we like wipe out a whole particular biosphere, not only the predators but also the prey, depends on where you're going to be on this spectrum. If you think that biosphere is just so bad that it's characterized by mostly lives that are not worth living, then you're going to want to wipe out, wipe out that biosphere and say better never for it to have been. If, however, you think that that biosphere is characterized mostly by lives that are worth living, or at least a little bit above average lives, then you would want intervention that wasn't as drastic, maybe like wiping out the predators and finding some way to keep the prey, the former prey alive, but limiting their population in some other way, like with contraceptives or something. And then the deer, let's say, would like get to live their happy deer lives without any wolves to hunt them anymore. Right?
Jason had something?
Oh yeah, I was also just.
If you could speak up so the camera.
I just think like I don't know if people have touched on zoos and the idea of just like having predators also in like a confined habitat where they wouldn't be. You could prevent them from eating herbivores.
Right. Yeah, like creating like a big fence and just keeping predators in there and give them lab-grown meat. I don't see how that's speciesist because we do that to people who are violent. We say, hey, we don't think that you're a bad person or that we are going to kill you, but you're violent to society and we need to keep you away. So if we're doing that to humans, keeping them separated, a dangerous one, I don't see why it would be speciesist to say the same to other animals. Say, hey, you are dangerous to other animals, so we're going to keep you separated and give you your lab-grown meat. Sorry, Lucas and then Julian.
I guess I was just going to when we're thinking about the lions, we should also be thinking about cats, right? Because they're also obligate carnivores, and what do we do? And then, I mean, I see arguments for people being like, okay, put them in vegan diets, they might get like, I don't know, diseases because of that, but at least they're not killing other animals. Then like, if that was the case for like a vegan to keep a cat, should they also like keep the cat enclosed into the house so that they're not able to go outside and kill other animals? Like, we had a cat in our community that was like gone for 3 days and like, they were vegan cats, but like, I imagine probably killed animals while they were gone, so. Isn't that another thing to think about?
I won't comment on veterinary concerns regarding cats, but I will say that I wouldn't want to be a mouse that was hunted down by one.
Yeah.
And if I were a benevolent genie and I were trying to create a world that was characterized by lots of happiness, I probably wouldn't put cats in it. Whether large cats or small cats, and because at least that is, I wouldn't make creatures that like hunt other creatures to such a large extent and cause them so much pain.
Yeah, I would say we do have a moral obligation to keep our cats indoors if they don't need to go outside. But whether it's healthy for them or not, I also don't have the knowledge. Julian, Gene, and then Jason.
I want to quickly reflect on the idea of institutionalizing a certain species and segregating them from, for example, their prey. I think the issue with that argument is that it doesn't separate the idea of greed and necessity. And I think that's one of the biggest issues when it comes to this argument when we're talking about intervention or divine intervention within the natural world and how we should impose our morality onto another species. And that imposition is affecting their necessity rather than their greed, which I myself don't believe the animal kingdom has. I don't believe greed is a natural thing in the animal world. I think it is a human endeavor, human trait. So when you talked about how we lock up murderers, it's when you use that as when you use that synonymously with the idea of morality within the natural world, you say that predator and prey is the same thing as murderer and victim. And I think there's a lot of quals and issues there that overlap. I just kind of want to open up that idea.
That's a good question. I guess this is leading us into free will. I don't know, Jay, do you have any thoughts?
What I'll say on that is simply that we as human beings, in the typical case, can understand, appreciate, and act on moral reasons. When reasons, I didn't say that clearly. So that means, in other words, we're moral agents. And as moral agents, we can be held accountable for our actions, or morally responsible, you might say, and it makes sense to blame us or praise us for what we do. Lions do not appreciate moral reasons in the same way. They're not moral agents. So it just doesn't make sense to like put them in court and like try them and say you were guilty and blame them, anything like that. It might make sense to separate them in a certain case from like harming someone, even if it's their prey.
Yeah, and like, no, I'll just leave it at that. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Catherine.
Yeah, because it's that whole topic about moral agency, I think it's completely wrong to confine an entire species that would otherwise be eating other species, because they don't see it the same way we do. They would never understand. They would just know that they're being confined and suffering, and that's wrong on our part. I believe so. And I also don't think that the lab-grown meat issue would solve the problem. I think, based on my puppies that I have back in Alabama, she was well-fed all the time. I gave her lots of food, and she still hunted squirrels almost every single day that she could. And I think that's because of instinct and pleasure, passing time, I guess. I'm not sure. So, do we have another approach?
So, your first point about they don't understand what they're doing, so therefore it's wrong to institutionalize them. But what if we think of humans that don't understand what they're doing because they have some sort of mental instability and they don't know what they're doing, and maybe there's a parasite, it's a virus, and they go around killing people. Would we then say, oh, he doesn't know what he's doing, let's just let them go around killing people? It doesn't matter whether they understand what they're doing or not. As long as they're harming others, we should try to stop that.
Of course, we should try, but I don't think confining them, just keeping them away from the prey is the right solution. So,
I'm not saying that it is, but I'm saying it's a possibility that the benefits outweigh the cost. Yeah, maybe 100 lions. We're not saying that we're going to put them in like small cages, but if we can give them a big room to run, and we do give them lab-grown meat, and no prey can get inside, you know, and those 1,000 lions save, you know, millions and millions of animals that were going to be eaten alive in pain like we saw. Yeah, maybe they won't be as happy hunting, but maybe we can make robot toys that they can hunt or whatever. But it's still not clear that just because they don't know what they're doing and just because they enjoy what they're doing, that we should let them harm others. I think Jean, and then
I think
Andrew.
Jason was next.
Jean, Jason, Andrew, and Julia.
We may be assuming this away anyway, but these predators are in part of their environments. They're not just plunked down. And the one that comes to mind is when they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone. And it completely transformed everything back to the way it had been like decades and decades before. Because it's not just the animal, you know, they're eating something. It's like, what is keystone species is the term used for like elephants and rhinos, and they completely are just part of the environment, and they totally affect how everything, all of the plants, the ground, everything all works together. So I don't know, I'm just having trouble with it, because it's one thing to say, well, nature is fine on its own, leave it alone, and it's another to what's the word I want? To not acknowledge the fact that it is a contained system that works in harmony when it's allowed to.
Yeah, so to that I would say, again, going back to the first objection that I said, don't think about whether we can do it or not. So I'm saying, like, one day when we do have that knowledge and we understand which ones are the keystone species and we understand which ones we can control without harming all the environment. Now, whether we can do that or not is a separate question, but I'm just saying, if we can get there, then, and we know that it's not going to cause more harm, or we think that it's not going to cause more harm, just like we do when we do human interventions, then we should act in the same ways. I think it was Jason, and then Andrew, and then Jason?
Yeah, I was also just interested in discussing like if anybody has concerns about, you know, perhaps what, you know, we're doing already to humans, and thinking about doing as far as, you know, CIA, FBI, you know, surveillance, especially in this country, you know, there's a huge surveillance going on, and, you know, do people feel comfortable being surveyed? I mean, it is going on right now, and if we were to do the same thing with animals, you know, maybe going so far as to implant nanotechnology into these animals and then being able to somehow communicate with them, or control their reflexes in a certain situation, you know, to basically, like, say if, you know, maybe your neighbor wanted to kill you and steal your car or something like that, you know, and somehow, you know, the FBI was like, oh, look at, you know, we see some thoughts in his mind, his brain neurochemistry is changing. Quick, we can, you know, send out, you know, some sort of electrical signal to change his her neurochemistry. You know, I think these are possibilities that are going to be coming up very quicker than we realize, and in fact, some possibilities already exist, and so we are already doing this with humans. And I was just curious to know what people's thoughts were on that.
Sounds like a sci-fi movie I'd love to see.
Is there anything right now for insulin, I think, for the chips that
I know the vaccines is a huge controversial issue for this election. A lot of people are, you know, very, you know, the possibility of vaccinating, you know, animals. That's one of the possibilities. I mean, we have potential laws that are coming up to vaccinate all humans, or, you know, in certain states.
Reflecting on what you just said, and sort of
Oh, I'm
going.
sorry, Zach had his hand up just quickly to respond to that point.
No, I was
Are you
just
good?
thinking of something else.
Okay, oh, Julia, then go ahead.
Yeah, so what I was going to say was, and just quickly going back to what I was saying about mixing human intervention and then with animal instinct, and just sort of what you said I thought was really interesting, because you were saying the idea of like, oh, I'm gonna kill you so you car. But that's the difference of saying I'm gonna murder someone and take their money versus I'm hungry. And those are the two differences between the brains of like a natural animal and what maybe human greed. And as just something that can become a product of that is dependency. If we consistently try to intervene on the life of an animal, they won't be able to learn how to do what they do best, which is maybe a predator who knows how to hunt. If we were to intervene and they were able to lose that trait, they would end up just like the squirrels at the Cal campus, constantly in need of food, constantly coming up to you, asking for your food, and they probably have absolutely no idea how to forage for themselves. They probably have absolutely no idea how to survive without humans, and then that becomes another issue. So yeah, just opening the floor for that as like a negative outcome or possibility to that type of intervention, technological intervention.
Yeah, in the interest of time, let's do like just 2 or 3 more questions. Danielle, Zach, and anyone else? Just 2 last ones? Okay, go ahead.
So a lot of the interventions that you mentioned in your presentation have to do with like preventing suffering, but I was interested to hear what you had to say about like suffering that's happening at the moment. For example, like my brother and I discussed, I mentioned to you earlier, my brother and I were discussing this video of this deer that was being eaten alive, and how traumatic that death was, and how long it took for the deer to like actually pass away before, they weren't suffering anymore. And I was just interested to find out what you guys thought about like how should humans intervene in situations like that where the animal is like actually suffering, like getting eaten alive. Should we like save the deer, but then the predator goes hungry and it might starve to death? Or should we kill the deer so that they're not suffering anymore, so the predator can still eat? Or should we just not do anything? Like, I'm interested to know like what.
So my response is I would do the same that I would do with humans. If there's a human that I know is going to go around eating humans for the rest of his life, so like say a zombie, if there's a zombie eating a human, I would save the human, and if the zombie's going to starve to death, whatever, I don't care, because I'm interested in saving this human. So if I would save this human, I would save that deer as well. That's what I would do. Jay?
Respond to that, like in the actual moment, like it just may be far more feasible to like kill the deer to like spare its suffering than to like drag the lion off the deer and like put it in a zoo. Just like in terms of, I know we're talking about what would be the moral thing to do if we had the capacity, but like if we can't do that ideal thing of like having that event not occur at all, then I like would probably like, if I were 100 feet away and like all I had was like a gun, then like I feel like if I shot the lion, then the lion dies, and then the deer like probably has been so like mauled and injured that it would suffer and die like 30 minutes later. Then like that, it just seems
right.
It seems like that's also on the table.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking like in the picture at the beginning, like if it was just like right at that moment, right? If like it's just about to start, you just see it happening in the wild, and you have a gun, and you're close enough. Who do you shoot?
Yeah, that's a different situation
right.
from if it were actively happening.
Who do you shoot, or do you not shoot anyone and say, "Oh, that's nature. I'm not going to intervene." Just think about it. If it were a zombie chasing a human, this one's going to keep eating animals for the rest of his life. It's going to keep eating humans for the rest of his life. Which one do you choose? I don't know.
He's not a zombie. Right.
He's not a zombie, but to his victims he is.
I know. And okay, think about spiders and flies. I try to save both of them. Who do you love more? Who do you love more, the cat or the gazelle? I mean, this is a really important issue because the predator is just as precious as the prey. And we have to think of it another way. I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But I don't think we should, I don't know what it is, but I do like the idea of culture groups. I do think we should intervene.
Yeah, my first instinct would be to stop it. Yeah, to stop it. Creating a barrier here, of course, that would be my first instinct.
growing for your garden, in your garden, and you've got some animals that are destroying them, would you use pesticide? I don't.
So on the point that
And I don't hurt the spider or the fly. I save the fly when I can, but I don't deny the spider its right to survive. And it does help my garden.
on this point that predators are just as precious as the prey, I think that's definitely true. It's true that cats have feelings just like we do. And they enjoy their lives as much as they can. I think that that's not the only thing that we should think about in terms of what we ought to do in the world. There are sometimes trade-offs where there's someone else whose interests are at stake, and that would be the gazelle in this example, who has feelings just like we do. And in this kind of dilemma type scenario, it's one individual's life or another. And in that case, you think also about the consequences and not just about whose interests are immediately at stake. So, and that's where Orlando was getting at with thinking about the consequences long term, that the one individual will kill lots of other gazelles and cause them a lot of pain, cause them a lot of misery. The gazelle won't be doing the same. And so it's purely on the basis of those consequences that the outcome was suggested, not saying that the cat doesn't matter.
Yeah, we're a little bit over time, so let's cut the live stream and let's just talk informally amongst each other. So you guys have questions to any of us or Zach or whatever.